Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the decline line in the McDonnell Gambit. Now, the McDonnell Gambit starts out with e4, e5, and then the King's Gambit with f4, my favorite opening in all of chess. After the pawn takes here, knight to f3, pawn g5, bishop c4, and then g4 attacking the pawn, and we're going to play knight to c3. Now, I did another video on the accepted line, so I highly recommend you check that out if you want to see the accepted line, and that is if the pawn takes on f3. But in this video, we are going to look at what happens if black does not take this knight on f3, partly because a lot of you asked for it as far as a requested video, but also I think it's better for black if they don't take this knight on f3. So we're going to be looking at 4 specific lines so you can see how that's going to play out. The first one is knight to c6. We're also going to look at bishop c5. We're going to look at d6, pretty common defense in the King's Gambit, as well as bishop g7. Now, first we need to think about what the threat is that white has. You know, if you play a6 from black, which again, they're not going to, but the threat really is knight to e5. Both the knight and the bishop are attacking this weak square here on f7, which is only defended by the king. So this is what white is threatening. So keep in mind as we're going through some of the variations, this is what they're up against. Even in this situation, if black wanted to be aggressive and try to attack, you know, queen h4, you could just play pawn g3. Hey, the pawn takes, but then boom, the bishop comes to f7. This is going to be check, king to d8, and then all of a sudden queen g4, and that stops the threat immediately. You know, queen takes, and the knight comes back to g4. So the first variation we're going to look at is knight c6. You can see right away it does stop that threat of knight to e5 that we talked about. After knight c6, we're going to castle on the king side. Definitely has a feel like the Muzio Gambit. Another video series that I've created both on the Muzio Gambit and the Triple Muzio Gambit. Definitely check those out if you are interested in this variation in the King's Gambit. But after we castle on the king side, the main line is just for them to take our knight on f3. We're going to capture with our queen, and then they have a few options from here. One of them could just be knight to f6. Okay, well, from here you can see that we can take with our queen on f4. And so they weren't really protecting that. And now we start to have a lot of pieces lined up on some weakened square for black. Yes, we no longer have our f pawn, and our king is somewhat exposed because they can always play something like bishop c5 here and check our king, but we can come to king to h1. We still have 2 pawns in front of it, but black does not have their g pawn, which is one of the weaknesses they have in this variation. And we have a lot of material. The bishop, both the queen and the rook eyeing down on this f file. Just a lot of pressure. So I don't think knight to f6 is going to be the best play for them. Another option that they have is bishop c5. They need to get more material involved into the game. Counterattacking in the center of the board. This is kind of an obvious one because it checks our king, so we need to move king to h1 here. But then they could play queen h4, get pretty aggressive. And I think this is the best play for black. So if you're looking at this and say, you know, what's optimal play? How should black respond if white goes into the McDonnell Gambit? I think this is the best play. Black has a slight advantage if they play the moves correctly. Now from here, white should play d4. And the reason for that is because black has a slight advantage, white needs to put black in as many opportunities so that they can fail. And from here, it may make sense for black to take on d4 with their bishop. And if they do, this is a mistake because white can now take back this pawn on f4. And from here, we have a lot of threats. Let's say they play d6, and we'll look at some other options as well. But now we have the move bishop g5. This is attacking the queen. We're starting to trap this queen here. Even if they play knight e5, which is attacking our own queen, well, now we can take with our bishop on f7. Check. They move their king. Now we can come back bishop to b3. And yes, they can take our queen here, but then we can take with our rook. This is check. They have to move their king, and now we're just going to come up here with rook to f7. They continue to move their king, get it in the center of the board, which is not where they want, and now we can take their queen on h4, and this is going to be a much better setup for white in the game. So if we come back here, I don't necessarily think that they're going to be playing d6. I think that would be a mistake. Another thing that they could play is knight to f6. Now, this blocks off some of the threats we have on the f-file, because remember, we were taking with our rook, we were attacking this f7 square. The knight on f6 does stop some of those threats. Now we can come back to g3 with our bishop, attacking the queen. Maybe the queen comes to g5. Now we can play knight b5 and attack on c7, forking the rook and the king. So we still have a lot of threats. We can still play bishop to f7. We can also play bishop c7 if we want to. So a lot of threats that we have. We can also get our rook to the center files, d1, particularly if we wanted to. So that's what happens. That's what we're kind of setting up and hoping that they take the bait if we play, pawn to d4 and they take with their bishop. Now, they should take with their knight right here because it attacks our queen. And so we can't just come up with our bishop and take on f4. We're essentially forced to take with our queen on f4. Now black is probably going to take with their queen on f4. We're going to take with our bishop. Our bishop is eyeing down this pawn on c7. They're eyeing down our pawn on c2. You can see we're eyeing down this pawn on f7 with our bishop, and we also have the rook behind that for protection. So if you count up the pawns, black has 6 pawns, white has 6 pawns. Both sides have the bishop pair. But you can see that black does have 2 knights. So white is going to be able to gobble up some material here, and they do have more of an attacking presence. But black has a better overall setup just from a material standpoint, and white has it cut out for them because they no longer have their their best piece, their queen. And so that's why the knight taking on d4 is the crucial move, because it forces the queen to move and essentially exchange off, where if the bishop takes on d4, well, now we can take with our bishop on f4, and we don't have to exchange our queen, and now our queen becomes a strong attacker, and our bishop can start to attack their queen. So that's why we want to give them an opportunity, because remember, even in this spot, black is definitely winning. This is the correct move order for them. But there's no other real option where we can even put them in a position where they can make a mistake. d4 is kind of our last-ditch effort. Okay, so that was what happens if they play knight c6 in the decline line. Next, we're going to be looking at bishop c5. Now, this does stop white from castling on the king side. So sometimes I feel like players are getting their dark square bishop involved into the game, stopping what is a pretty common move for us to castle here. But I think this is a pretty poor move from black because we just have d4. It's completely fine with us if we want to attack the center of the board, open up for our own dark square bishop to get involved into the game here. If they just come to b4, okay, well, now we can even just castle on the king side, and we don't even have to worry about a lot of their threats. Yes, if they take our knight, we're going to continue with the same game plan as before. We take with our queen, and this is fine. We don't even care about our knight here on c3, and they've moved their dark square bishop twice, and they're not really developing their own setup. All of a sudden, we have all of the pieces that we really want to get involved into the action. So I don't think this is the optimal play for black. So that's bishop to c5. I just don't think you're going to see it all too often. If you do, just know it is a mistake. Another thing that you could see is d6. This is a pretty common line that you'll see from black players playing the King's Gambit decline lines, just because they feel like, hey, it opens up for the light square bishop to defend this pawn on g4. But from here, same thing. We're going to castle on the king side. We don't care too much. We want them to take our knight here. That's completely fine. If they do take, we continue with the same game plan we have for our other variations. We take with our queen. Now, from here, they could play bishop g7. But then we're just going to take with our queen on f4 because this pawn on d2 has not moved yet. We just want to start gobbling out material. And also we just put more pressure on this f7 square right here. So they could now come down to d4. Remember, they have the threat they have to worry about on f7 with our queen, rook, and the bishop. So getting material involved, attacking our king. Yeah, we can come over to h1. Now they could play knight to f6. This is protected by their queen. They do have to just stop the threat on this f file. But again, white has a lot of threats they can deal with. This bishop on d4 also stops us from coming here to d4 with our pawn. But we can always, at some point, play d3, get our dark square bishop involved into the game, start to put pressure on our opponent. So the last variation we are going to look at is instead of coming to d6, if our opponent plays bishop to g7. We're going to play the same thing that you would hopefully expect by now. We're going to castle on the king side. From here, main line is just for them to take with their pawn on f3. We're going to take with our queen and knight to c6 from black. Now we are going to take with our queen on f4, and you can start to see the threats that we have coming together and all the variations that are kind of building up to this, where bishop to g7 makes a lot of sense. It fianchet as their bishop. It attacks the center of the board here. But because of the move order in this particular variation, it's very difficult for them to hold on to all of the threats that white has. Let's say they play knight to f6. Remember, the queen and the rook are attacking the f7 square. But now we can play e5. And how do they really continue from here? Well, they can stop it with their knight. They can't just move this knight away, because if they just come back to g8 or h5, we just come up here and that is going to be checkmate. So they can't do that. They could take the pawn on e5, but then after that we just take with our queen. They could come to e7, but then we take on c7. We're just gobbling up more material here. So none of those are particularly good. They could, instead of playing knight to f6, recognize that that's not a good way to counter. They could play queen f6, but now we have the threat bishop takes on f7. They can't take with their queen and say, yes, my king's protecting it. We have the queen and the rook eyeing this down. This is going to be checkmate for white after a few moves. There's no way for them to stop this threat here. And so we know that is not a viable option as well. So after bishop to f7, they really need to play like king to d8. And then we can play our queen to g3. This is a discovered attack on the queen here. They can't take our bishop again because the rook is protecting it. So now we're attacking the queen. The bishop's kind of safe here. The king on d8 is not well protected. We still have a lot of pieces involved into the attack. We're going to be getting our pawn on the d file involved. So our dark square bishop can get involved into the game. You can see if we bring our bishop to g5, that would pin down the queen to the king. So we do have a ton of threats that black has to deal with. So hopefully this gives you an idea of the threats in the McDonnell Gambit. Again, early on for black, if you're looking at it and you're curious how you should respond, I think the best play is for black to play knight to c6. But if they don't, white can put a ton of pressure. And even if they do, you hopefully now know the best way for white to continue to hopefully set up black for more traps where you can have a lethal attack. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you have other ideas on other openings or just ideas for videos in general, you can let me know in the comments below. But thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.